The autumn wind howled through the streets of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. It was October 15, 2019, and the small industrial town was settling into its usual quiet evening routine. Street lights flickered on along Maple Street, casting long shadows between the modest two-story houses that lined the neighborhood. 8-year-old Tommy Martinez pressed his face against the cold window of his bedroom, watching his neighbor Mr. Henrik Johansson work late in his backyard forge. The rhythmic clang, clang of hammer on steel had become as familiar to Tommy as his own heartbeat. Henrik, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with calloused hands and silver-streaked hair, had been the town's blacksmith for over 20 years, crafting everything from decorative ironwork to practical tools. "Tommy, come away from the window and finish your homework," called his mother Elena from downstairs. Her voice carried the gentle firmness that only a single mother working 2 jobs could master. "But Mom, Mr. Henrik is making something cool. It's glowing red." Tommy's breath fogged the glass as he spoke. Elena Martinez climbed the narrow staircase, her nurse's uniform rustling with each step. At 32, she bore the weight of responsibility in her dark eyes, but her love for her son remained unwavering despite the challenges of raising him alone. After her husband's death in a car accident 3 years prior, "You can watch him. Work tomorrow, Mio. Right now, you need to focus on your math problems." Tommy reluctantly turned away from the window, but not before noticing something odd. Henrik seemed agitated tonight, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Instead of his usual methodical work, he was pacing around the forge, occasionally stopping to stare at their house with an expression Tommy couldn't quite understand. Across the street, Henrik wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool evening air. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his hammer. The letter from the bank lay crumpled on his workbench, the final notice. 3 months behind on the mortgage, and Elena Martinez had been assigned as the nurse for his late wife's hospice care. The same Elena who now lived in the house he'd been forced to sell to pay for his wife's medical bills. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Martinez family was living in what should have been his retirement home, while he faced foreclosure on his shop and the small apartment above it. The grief of losing his wife Margaret 6 months ago had morphed into something darker, a resentment that ate at him like rust on iron. Henrik's rational mind knew it wasn't Elena's fault. She'd been nothing but kind and professional during Margaret's final weeks, but grief and financial desperation had a way of twisting logic, and in his darkest moments, he blamed her for bills he couldn't pay and a life that felt like it was slipping away. The plan had formed slowly, like a poison seeping into groundwater. If the house were to have an accident, a fire, perhaps the insurance money would solve his problems. Elena would be compensated, relocated somewhere better. The boy would be safer away from this neighborhood anyway. It was twisted logic, but to Henrik's grief-addled mind, it almost made sense. At 11:47 p.m., Henrik made his move. He'd studied the house for weeks, knew that Elena worked night shifts at the hospital on Tuesdays and Thursdays, leaving Tommy with Mrs. Chen, the elderly babysitter who slept soundly in the guest room. The timing had to be perfect, late enough for everyone to be asleep, but early enough for him to make sure everyone got out safely. The basement window was unlocked, just as he'd observed. Henrik slipped inside, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would wake the whole house. He'd brought an accelerant, paint thinner from his workshop, and some old rags. The plan was simple: start a small fire in the basement, let it grow just enough to trigger the smoke alarms, then coincidentally be the first to respond and help evacuate everyone. But as Henrik crept through the dark basement, something went wrong. His hands, shaking with adrenaline and guilt, knocked over a can of paint thinner. The liquid splashed across the concrete floor, far more than he'd intended. When he lit the first rag, the flames spread with terrifying speed. Racing across the floor and up the wooden support beams, the fire roared to life with a hunger that shocked him. This wasn't the controlled burn he'd planned. This was a monster, and it was growing fast. Smoke began pouring through the floor vents, and Henrik realized with growing horror that his careful plan had become a death trap. Upstairs, Tommy jerked awake to the acrid smell of smoke. His room was hazy, and he could hear a crackling sound from below. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Fear had stolen his breath. The hallway was filling with smoke, and Tommy could see an orange glow coming from the stairwell. Mrs. Chen's door was closed, and when he tried to open it, the handle was already hot to the touch. Panic set in as the 8-year-old realized the house was on fire, and he was trapped in the basement. Henrik fought through the smoke and flames, desperately trying to reach the stairs. His plan had become a nightmare, and all he could think about was the innocent boy sleeping upstairs. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. What had he done? The smoke was so thick now that Henrik could barely see his hands in front of his face. His lungs burned, and he could feel the heat of the flames on his back. But he had to get to Tommy. He had to fix this. Henrik stumbled up the basement stairs, his clothes singed and his face streaked with soot. The main floor was already filling with smoke, and he could hear Tommy's frightened cries from the second floor. Mrs. Chen's bedroom door was blocked by debris from a partially collapsed ceiling beam. "Tommy!" Henrik shouted, his voice raw from smoke inhalation. "Tommy, where are you?" "I'm here. I'm scared," came the reply from the top of the stairs. Henrik looked up and saw the boy, small and terrified, standing at the top of the staircase. But the stairs were already compromised. Several steps had burned through, and the banister was engulfed in flames. Without hesitation, Henrik grabbed a heavy blanket from the living room couch and wrapped it around himself. The flames had spread to the main floor now, and he could feel the heat intensifying by the second. He had to reach Tommy before the ceiling collapsed. "Stay right there. Boy, don't move," Henrik called out as he began climbing the damaged staircase, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The third step crumbled under his boot, and Henrik barely caught himself on the banister. The flames licked at his arms through the blanket, but he kept climbing. For steps 5, 6, Tommy was crying now, overwhelmed by the smoke and heat. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "I'm coming, Tommy. I'm coming to get you." When Henrik finally reached the top of the stairs, he found Tommy collapsed on the floor, overcome by smoke inhalation. The boy was conscious, but weak, his small body struggling against the toxic fumes. Henrik scooped Tommy up in his arms, wrapping him in the blanket. "Hold on tight, son. We're getting out of here." The journey back down the stairs was a nightmare. Several more steps had burned through, and Henrik had to jump across gaps while carrying Tommy. The ceiling was beginning to sag ominously, and he could hear the groaning of wood and metal as the house's structure began to fail. They made it to the main floor just as the living room ceiling partially collapsed, sending burning debris cascading down where they'd been standing moments before. Henrik's back was burned, his clothes were smoking, and every breath felt like fire. But Tommy was alive in his arms. The front door was blocked by fallen debris, but Henrik remembered the kitchen window. He kicked out the glass and lifted Tommy through first, then hauled himself out just as the kitchen ceiling began to cave in. They collapsed on the front lawn, both of them coughing and gasping for clean air. Tommy was conscious but weak, his face streaked with soot and tears. Henrik held him close, his own body shaking with exhaustion and the magnitude of what had just happened. "It's okay, son. You're safe now. You're safe." In the distance, Henrik could hear sirens approaching, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. Soon the street would be full of first responders, and he would have to answer questions about how the fire started and how he'd happened to be the first on the scene. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was the small boy in his arms, breathing and alive. The same boy whose life he had endangered, and the same boy he had risked everything to save. As the fire trucks rounded the corner, their red lights painting the scene in urgent colors, Henrik made a silent promise to Tommy and to himself. He would carry the weight of what he'd done for the rest of his life, but he would also spend every remaining day making sure Tommy was safe and cared for. The truth was a burden he would have to live with, but the boy's life was a gift he had been given the chance to preserve. And in that moment, as the flames consumed the house behind them and the sirens grew louder, Henrik Johansson began the long journey from destroyer to protector. From the man who set the fire to the man who would spend the rest of his life making amends for it. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, and Cedar Falls had rallied around the Martinez family with the kind of community support that small towns are known for. The local Methodist church had organized a clothing drive. The school district had provided Tommy with new supplies, and the mayor had even set up a fund to help Elena find new housing. Tommy was staying with his Aunt Rosa in the neighboring town of Millbrook while Elena worked with insurance adjusters and searched for a new place to live. The boy had been lucky. Aside from some smoke inhalation and a few minor burns on his hands, he'd escaped the fire relatively unharmed, physically, at least, but the nightmares came every night. "I keep dreaming about the smoke," Tommy told Dr. Sarah Coleman, the child psychologist Elena had found through the hospital's employee assistance program. "And I hear Mr. Henrik calling my name, but I can't see him because everything is dark." Dr. Coleman, a patient woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, nodded thoughtfully. "That's very normal, Tommy. You went through something very scary, and your mind is trying to process it. Tell me more about Mr. Henrik. How do you feel about him?" Tommy shifted in his chair, his small hands fidgeting with a stress ball. "He saved me. He came into the fire to get me when I couldn't get out. He was really brave." "He was brave," Dr. Coleman agreed. "And how does that make you feel?" "Happy that he helped me, but also weird." "Weird how?" Tommy struggled to find the words, like, why was he awake so late? And why did he know I was in the house? Mom was at work. And Mrs. Chen. His voice trailed off as he remembered the elderly babysitter who had died in the fire. Unable to escape from her room, Dr. Coleman leaned forward slightly. "Those are very smart questions, Tommy. Sometimes when scary things happen, our minds try to make sense of them by asking questions. That's okay." But even as she reassured the boy, Dr. Coleman couldn't shake her own questions about the fire. She'd reviewed the preliminary fire department report, and there were inconsistencies that troubled her. The fire had started in the basement, but there was no electrical equipment down there that could have sparked such an intense blaze. And Henrik Johansson's presence at the scene. How had he known to respond so quickly? Across town, Henrik was dealing with his own demons. The official story was that he'd been working late in his forge when he smelled smoke and saw flames coming from the Martinez house. He'd immediately called 911 and then rushed to help evacuate anyone inside. The fire chief had called him a hero, and the local newspaper had run a front-page story about his brave rescue of Tommy. But the weight of the truth was crushing him. Henrik sat in his small apartment above the forge, staring at the newspaper. Clipping. The headline read, "Local blacksmith saves boy from house fire." Below it was a photo of him holding Tommy outside the burning house, both of them covered in soot and ash. To everyone else, it was a story of heroism. To Henrik, it was evidence of the most shameful act of his life. He'd tried to return to his normal routine, but everything felt different now. The rhythmic hammering that had once been meditative now sounded like the drumbeat of his guilt. Every time he heated metal in the forge, he was reminded of the flames he'd started. Every time he looked across the street at the charred remains of the Martinez house, he felt the weight of Mrs. Chen's death and the trauma he'd inflicted on Tommy. The insurance investigation was still ongoing, but so far, no one suspected arson. The fire department had ruled it an accident, possibly caused by faulty wiring or a gas leak. Henrik knew he should feel relieved, but instead, he felt trapped by his secret. One evening, as Henrik was closing up his shop, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Elena Martinez standing on his doorstep, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Martinez," Henrik said, his voice catching slightly. How are you holding up? I wanted to thank you," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion, "for saving Tommy. The doctors said that if you hadn't gotten to him when you did." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Henrik understood. The smoke inhalation would have killed the boy within minutes. "I'm just glad he's okay," Henrik managed to say, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "I also wanted to ask you something," Elena continued. "Tommy's been having nightmares. and the psychologist thinks it might help if he could talk to you about what happened that night. Would you be willing to see him?" Henrik's heart clenched. The last thing he wanted was to face Tommy, to look into the eyes of the boy whose life he'd endangered. But how could he refuse, of course? He said, "Whatever Tommy needs." Elena smiled for the first time since the fire. "Thank you, Henrik. I know this isn't easy for you either. You went through something traumatic too." If only she knew, Henrik thought. If only she knew that the trauma wasn't what had happened to him, but what he had done. 2 days later, Tommy sat nervously in Henrik's workshop, his Aunt Rosa waiting. Outside in the car, the space was exactly as Tommy remembered from peering through the window. A large forge in the center, tools hanging from the walls, and the smell of metal and coal dust in the air. "I used to watch you work," Tommy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the autumn wind rattling the windows. "I know," Henrik replied, his hands busy with a piece of decorative ironwork to avoid looking directly at the boy. "I saw you at your window sometimes. Were you working that night when the fire started?" The question hit Henrik like a physical blow. He set down his hammer and finally turned to face Tommy. The boy's eyes were wide and curious, but also haunted by what he'd experienced. "Yes," Henrik said, choosing his words carefully. "I was working late. That's how I noticed the smoke so." Quickly, Tommy nodded, as if this explained something that had been bothering him. "I was scared," he admitted. "I couldn't find Mrs. Chen, and the smoke was everywhere. You were very brave," Henrik said, and he meant it. Braver than most adults would have been. "But I wasn't brave. I was just scared and trying not to die." The simple honesty of the statement cut through Henrik's heart. Here was a child who had faced death because of his actions, and all Tommy could think about was how scared he'd been. Sometimes being brave means being scared and doing what you have to do anyway. Henrik said softly, "You survived, Tommy. That took courage." They talked for nearly an hour, with Tommy asking questions about the fire and Henrik answering as honestly as he could, without revealing the terrible truth. When Rosa finally came to collect Tommy, the boy seemed calmer, more at peace. "Thank you, Mr. Henrik," Tommy said as they prepared to leave. "Will you teach me how to make things in the forge someday?" The question was innocent, but it hit Henrik like a lightning bolt. Here was this boy, who had every reason to fear fire, asking to learn the craft that had driven Henrik to commit his crime in the first place. "Maybe someday," Henrik said, his voice barely steady. "When you're older." That night, Henrik sat in his apartment, staring at the bottle of whiskey he'd bought, but hadn't opened. The weight of his secret was becoming unbearable. Tommy trusted him, Elena trusted him. The whole town saw him as a hero, but heroes didn't start fires that killed innocent people. Heroes didn't endanger children out of grief and desperation. He thought about confessing, about walking into the police station and telling them the truth. But what good would that do now? Mrs. Chen was dead. Tommy was traumatized, and Elena had lost everything. His confession wouldn't bring back what was lost, and it would only add to their pain. Instead, Henrik made a different decision. He would carry this burden for the rest of his life, but he would also dedicate that life to making amends. He would watch over Tommy and Elena, protect them, help them rebuild. It wouldn't balance the scales, but it was the only path to redemption he could see. The next morning, Henrik began making plans. He would sell his forge and use the money to help Elena find a new house. He would move away from Cedar Falls, far enough that his presence wouldn't be a constant reminder of the tragedy, but close enough that he could still watch over Tommy from a distance. It wasn't forgiveness. He could never forgive himself for what he'd done, but it was a beginning, the first step on a long journey toward making things right. As he worked that day, hammering out what might be his last piece in the forge where he'd planned his crime, Henrik thought about the strange turns life could take. He had set out to destroy, but had ended up saving. He had acted out of grief and desperation, but had found a purpose that might, in time, give his life meaning again. The fire had taken much from all of them, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond between a broken man and the boy he'd saved. It was a bond built on secrecy and guilt, but also on love and protection. And for now, that would have to be enough. 6 months had passed since the fire, and spring was coming to Cedar Falls. The charred remains of the Martinez house had been cleared away, leaving behind an empty lot where dandelions and wild grass were beginning to grow. It was a sign of renewal, but for those who remembered what had stood there, it was also a reminder of what had been lost. Tommy was adjusting to life in Millbrook with his Aunt Rosa, but the commute to his old school in Cedar Falls meant he could still see his friends and maintain some normalcy. The nightmares had become less frequent, thanks to his sessions with Dr. Coleman, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Some nights, he would wake up gasping, convinced he could smell smoke. Elena had found a new position at the Regional Medical Center in Millbrook, which paid better than her old job but required longer hours. The insurance settlement had been generous enough to cover their immediate needs, but starting over wasn't easy. She missed the community she'd built in Cedar Falls, the familiar faces, and the sense of belonging that comes with years of shared experience. Henrik had made good on his private promise to help from a distance. He'd sold his forge and most of his equipment, using the money to anonymously contribute to Tommy's college fund through the community foundation. He'd also found Elena's car in the hospital parking lot one morning and left an envelope with cash and a note for Tommy's school supplies. From a friend who cares, Elena had puzzled over the anonymous gifts, but Rosa had convinced her to accept them gracefully. "Someone wants to help," Rosa had said. "In times like these, you let people help." Henrik had relocated to a small town called Riverside, about an hour's drive from Cedar Falls. He'd found work as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant, a job that used his mechanical skills but didn't require him to work with fire. The pay was decent, and more importantly, the work was steady and predictable, qualities that had become precious to him. But even with the distance and the new routine, Henrik couldn't escape the weight of what he'd done. He'd started attending AA meetings, not because he had a drinking problem, but because he needed to be around people who understood the burden of shame and the difficulty of living with secrets. The meetings followed a familiar pattern: people sharing their struggles, admitting their mistakes, and working toward redemption. "My name is Henrik," he would say when it was his turn to speak, "and I'm living with the consequences of a terrible decision I made." He never told them what that decision was, but he talked about guilt and the daily struggle to find meaning in a life overshadowed by regret. The group members nodded with understanding. They knew what it was like to carry the weight of actions that couldn't be undone. One evening in late April, Henrik was surprised to find Tommy and Elena at his apartment door. He'd been careful to keep his distance, but Tommy had apparently insisted on visiting the man who'd saved his life. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by," Elena said, holding a covered dish. "Tommy wanted to bring you some of Rose's tamales. She made extras." Henrik's heart raced as he let them in. The apartment was sparse but clean, with few personal belongings beyond the essentials. What stood out was a small framed photo on the kitchen table, a picture of Tommy and Elena from the newspaper article about the fire. "You kept the picture?" Tommy observed, his voice filled with curiosity rather than suspicion. "It reminded me of something good," Henrik said carefully. "Sometimes we need reminders of the good things." Tommy wandered around the small apartment while Elena and Henrik talked. The boy seemed different, older somehow, more serious than an 8-year-old should be. The fire had changed him, just as it had changed all of them. "How are you sleeping?" Henrik asked Tommy, remembering his own sleepless nights. "Better," Tommy said. "But I still dream about the fire sometimes, do you?" The question caught Henrik off guard. "Sometimes," he admitted. "What do you dream about?" Henrik considered his words carefully. "I dream about being too late, about not being able to help." It was true, in a way. His nightmares often featured scenarios where he arrived too late to save Tommy, where his plan had succeeded in its most terrible form. But he also dreamed about the moment he'd lit that first rag, about the sickening realization that he'd unleashed something beyond his control. "But you weren't too late," Tommy said with the simple logic of childhood. "You saved me." "Yes," Henrik said quietly. "I saved you." Elena had been watching this exchange with interest. There was something in Henrik's manner that she couldn't quite identify. a heaviness that seemed to go beyond the trauma of the rescue itself. She'd seen this kind of weight before, in patients who carried deep guilt about things beyond their control. "Henrik," she said gently, "have you talked to anyone about what happened? A counselor, I mean?" Henrik shook his head. "I'm managing. It's just that survivor's guilt is real, even for heroes, especially for heroes. Sometimes, if only she knew," Henrik thought. If only she knew that his guilt had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with what he'd set in motion. They stayed for about an hour, with Tommy asking questions about Henrik's new job and Elena sharing updates about their life in Millbrook. When they finally left, Henrik felt both grateful for the visit and deeply troubled by it. The more time he spent with them, the more he cared about their well-being, and the more unbearable his secret became. A week later, Henrik made a decision that would change everything. He drove to Cedar Falls and parked outside the police station, a handwritten confession in his jacket pocket. He'd spent hours writing it, trying to find the words to explain what he'd done and why he'd done it. But as he sat in his car, staring at the building where he would destroy his life and possibly harm Tommy and Elena even more, he couldn't bring himself to get out. The confession remained in his pocket, a constant reminder of the choice he couldn't seem to make. Instead, he drove to the cemetery where Mrs. Chen had been buried. Her grave was marked by a simple headstone, "Li Chen, beloved mother and grandmother." Someone had left fresh flowers, probably her son, who had flown in from California for the funeral. "I'm sorry," Henrik whispered to the headstone. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He knelt by the grave and placed his own flowers there, white lilies that seemed pure, for such a dark offering. As he stood to leave, Henrik noticed a figure watching him from across the cemetery. It was Fire Chief Robert Martinez, Elena's former brother-in-law, who had led the investigation into the fire. He was a tall, weathered man with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that made people want to confess their secrets. "Henrik," Chief Martinez called out as he approached. "I thought that might be you." "Chief Martinez," Henrik replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just paying my respects." "Mrs. Chen was a good woman," the chief said, his eyes studying Henrik's face. "Her death was the hardest part of this whole thing. Well, that and not being able to give the family better answers about how it started." Henrik's pulse quickened. "I thought you ruled it an accident. Officially, yes. But between you and me, something about that fire never sat right. The burn patterns, the intensity, the way it spread so fast. It had all the hallmarks of an accelerant fire." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. "Of course," Chief Martinez continued, "without physical evidence of arson, and with no clear motive, we had to close the case. Sometimes the truth is less important than giving people closure." Henrik nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You did a good thing that night," the chief said. "Finally, whatever else happened, you saved that boy's life. That's what matters." As Chief Martinez walked away, Henrik realized that his secret might not be as secret as he'd thought. But rather than feeling exposed, he felt a strange sense of relief. Someone else knew, or at least suspected, and the world hadn't ended. That night, Henrik called the crisis hotline listed in the phone book. He didn't give his name, but he talked to a volunteer counselor about guilt and the weight of secrets. The counselor listened without judgment and offered resources for people struggling with trauma and moral injury. Sometimes, the counselor said, the path to healing isn't about confessing everything to everyone. Sometimes it's about finding a way to make amends and live with purpose despite our mistakes. It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. Henrik hung up the phone and looked at the confession letter he'd written. After a moment's hesitation, he tore it into small pieces and threw them away. He would carry his secret, but he would also carry his responsibility. He would watch over Tommy and Elena, protect them, and try to build something good from the ashes of his worst decision. It wasn't forgiveness. He could never forgive himself, but it was a way forward. And sometimes, a way forward was enough. 2 years had passed since the fire, and Cedar Falls had settled into a new rhythm. The empty lot where the Martinez house once stood had been purchased by the city and converted into a small memorial park. A plaque honored the memory of Li Chen, and a playground honored the resilience of those who had survived. It was a place where children could play and families could gather, transforming a site of tragedy into one of community healing. Tommy, now 10 years old, had grown taller and more confident. The nightmares had finally stopped, replaced by dreams of becoming a firefighter like his uncle Roberto. He joined the local youth fire safety program and could recite fire prevention tips. With the enthusiasm that only a child could muster, Elena had found her footing in Millbrook, building new friendships and establishing herself as a respected member of the medical community. She'd even started dating again. A kind pediatrician named David who understood her caution and respected her devotion to Tommy. Life was beginning to feel normal again, or at least a new version of normal. Henrik had become a fixture in their lives, though he was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. He attended Tommy's school events, helped with homework when asked, and had become something like an uncle to the boy. Elena welcomed his presence, grateful for the stable male influence in Tommy's life and unaware of the true depth of Henrik's commitment to their well-being. But the weight of his secret was taking its toll. Henrik had developed chronic insomnia and had lost weight. The stress of living with his guilt while maintaining the facade of being Tommy's hero was wearing him down. He'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. James Morrison, though he'd been careful not to reveal the full truth even in that confidential setting. "I'm struggling with something I did," Henrik told Dr. Morrison during one of their sessions. "Something that hurt people, even though I tried to fix it afterward." Dr. Morrison, a patient man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle manner, nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell me more about what happened?" Henrik hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I made a decision that put someone in danger, a child. I was able to help him when things went wrong, but I can't escape the knowledge that I was responsible for putting him in that situation in the first place." "That sounds like a heavy burden to carry," Dr. Morrison observed. "Have you considered that your actions afterward, helping the child, might be a form of redemption?" "How can there be redemption for something like that?" Henrik asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past," Dr. Morrison explained. "It's about learning from our mistakes and choosing to do better. It's about taking responsibility for our actions and working to make amends." Henrik wanted to believe it was that simple, but he knew the truth was more complicated. How do you make amends for starting a fire that killed an innocent woman? How do you atone for traumatizing a child, even if you later saved his life? The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, almost exactly 3 years after the fire. Tommy was spending the night at Henrik's apartment, a regular occurrence that had developed over the months, and they were working on a history project about local heroes. "I want to write about you," Tommy announced, looking up from his notebook. "About how you saved me from the fire." Henrik's heart clenched. "I'm not sure I'm the right kind of hero for your project." "Tommy, what do you mean?" Tommy asked, his 10-year-old mind struggling to understand why anyone would object to being called a hero. Henrik set down the tool he'd been cleaning and sat across from Tommy at the small kitchen table. The boy looked so much like his father, the same dark eyes, the same curious expression. In that moment, Henrik knew he couldn't carry his secret any longer. "Tommy," he said carefully, "what if I told you that heroes aren't always the people who save the day? What if I told you that sometimes the people who help us are the same people who hurt us in the first place?" Tommy frowned, trying to process this complex idea. "I don't understand." Henrik took a deep breath. "The fire that night, it didn't start by accident." "What do you mean?" "Someone started that fire on purpose. Someone who was hurting and angry and made a terrible decision." Tommy's eyes widened. "Who would do something like that?" Henrik met the boy's gaze, his own eyes filled with shame and regret. "I did, Tommy. I started the fire." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy stared at Henrik, his young mind struggling to reconcile the man who had saved his life with the man who had endangered it. But you rescued me," Tommy said finally, his voice small and confused. "Yes," Henrik said, tears streaming down his face. "I started the fire, but then I realized what I'd done. I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake, and I had to save you. I had to try to fix what I'd broken." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but serious. "Why did you start the fire?" Henrik struggled to find words that a 10-year-old could understand. "I was very sad and very angry. My wife had died, and I was losing my house, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought that if your house burned down, the insurance money would help your mom, and I could solve my problems too. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. Mrs. Chen died because of the fire," Tommy said quietly. "Yes." Henrik's voice broke. "Mrs. Chen died because of what I did. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of this revelation settling between them. Finally, Tommy spoke again. "Are you going to tell the police?" "I don't know," Henrik admitted. "I've wanted to for 3 years, but I was afraid it would hurt you and your mom even more." Tommy considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "I think," he said slowly, "that lying about it hurts more than telling the truth." The wisdom in this simple statement hit Henrik like a physical blow. Here was a child who had been through trauma and loss, offering him guidance about honesty and courage. "You're right," Henrik said. "You're absolutely right." Tommy reached across the table and placed his small hand on Henrik's larger one. "I'm still glad you saved me," he said quietly. "Even if you started the fire, you could have just run away, but you didn't." The simple forgiveness in Tommy's voice broke something inside Henrik that had been holding him together for 3 years. He sobbed openly, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his guilt and the unexpected grace of this child's understanding. "I'm so sorry, Tommy. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, to Mrs. Chen, to your mom." "I know," Tommy said, "and I forgive you. But I think you need to tell my mom and the police too." That night, after Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, Henrik sat at his kitchen table and wrote a new confession letter. This one was different from the others, more complete, more honest, and written with the knowledge that he would actually deliver it. The next morning, Henrik called Elena and asked if he could come over. There was something important he needed to tell her and Tommy together. Elena sensed the gravity in his voice and agreed immediately. When Henrik arrived at their house in Millbrook, she had coffee ready and Tommy was waiting at the kitchen table, his expression serious but calm. "Tommy told me you have something important to share," Elena said, her nursing instincts already picking up on Henrik's distress. Henrik nodded and pulled out the letter he'd written. "Before I say anything, I want you both to know that I love you. You've become my family, and that's what makes this so hard." He handed Elena the letter. "I think it might be easier if you read this first." Elena opened the letter and began to read. Henrik watched her face change as the truth unfolded, confusion giving way to shock, then horror, then something more complex that he couldn't quite identify. When she finished reading, Elena set the letter down with shaking hands. "You started the fire," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, you killed Mrs. Chen. Yes, you put my son in danger. Yes." Henrik's voice was steady now, accepting the full weight of her accusations. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing. Finally, she looked up at him. "But you also saved him. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Elena agreed. "It doesn't excuse it, but it complicates it." Tommy spoke up then, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Mom, Henrik told me everything last night. I was mad at first, but then I realized something. He's been taking care of us for 3 years because he felt bad about what he did. He's been trying to make it right." Elena looked at her son with amazement. "When had he become so wise? Is that true?" she asked Henrik. "Have you been helping us out of guilt?" "It started that way," Henrik admitted. "But it became something more. You and Tommy, you became the family I thought I'd lost forever. Taking care of you gave my life meaning again." Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden she'd planted in their backyard. The silence stretched on for several minutes before she spoke again. "I should hate you," she said without turning around. "Mrs. Chen was like a grandmother to Tommy. She was a good woman who didn't deserve to die, I know. And you put my son through trauma that took years to heal. I know." Elena turned back to face him. But I've watched you with Tommy these past 3 years. I've seen how much you care about him, how dedicated you are to his well-being. You've been more present in his life than his own father ever was." Henrik was surprised by this admission. Elena rarely spoke about her deceased husband. "I've also seen how this has eaten away at you," she continued. "You've been carrying this guilt like a weight around your neck, and now I understand why." "What happens now?" Henrik asked. Elena looked at Tommy, then back at Henrik. "Now you go to the police and tell them the truth. All of it. What about you and Tommy? What about our relationship?" Elena considered this carefully. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time to process this. Tommy and I both do. But Henrik, turning yourself in is the right thing to do, for Mrs. Chen's family, for the community, and for yourself." That afternoon, Henrik walked into the Cedar Falls police station with his confession letter in hand. Chief Martinez was there, along with Detective Sarah Williams, who had worked the original case. They read his statement in silence, then asked him to tell them everything in his own words. Henrik spoke for over 2 hours, detailing his grief after Margaret's death, his financial struggles, his twisted plan for the fire, and the horror he'd felt when he realized what he'd unleashed. He told them about saving Tommy, about the 3 years of guilt and secrecy, and about his decision to finally come forward. "Why now?" Detective Williams asked. "Why confess? After all this time?" "Because a 10-year-old boy taught me that lying about it hurts more than telling the truth," Henrik said, "and because Mrs. Chen's family deserves to know what really happened." The legal process that followed was complicated. Henrik was charged with second-degree murder for Mrs. Chen's death, arson in the first degree, and child endangerment. His lawyer argued for leniency based on his mental state at the time, his immediate attempt to rescue Tommy, and his 3 years of making amends. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Morgan, argued that his crimes were too serious to overlook, regardless of his subsequent actions. The case drew national attention, with media outlets struggling to categorize a story that defied simple narratives. Was Henrik a villain who had redeemed himself, or a hero whose heroism was tainted by his crimes? The answer, like most truths, was complex. Tommy and Elena both testified at the sentencing hearing. Tommy, now 11, spoke about forgiveness and second chances. Elena talked about the man Henrik had become and the positive impact he'd had on their lives, while also acknowledging the pain his original actions had caused. Mrs. Chen's son, Dr. Michael Chen, also spoke. "My mother believed in redemption," he said. "She believed that people could change, could become better than their worst moments. I think she would want Mr. Johansson to have a chance to continue making amends in the end." Henrik was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 5. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but acknowledged the complex nature of his case. As Henrik was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Tommy and Elena in the courtroom. Tommy gave him a small wave, and Elena nodded once, gestures that told him he hadn't lost their love entirely. 5 years later, Henrik was released on parole. He'd used his time in prison to earn a degree in social work and had become a counselor for other inmates struggling with guilt and addiction. The man who emerged from prison was different from the one who had entered, calmer, more purposeful, and dedicated to service. Tommy, now 16, was the first person to visit Henrik after his release. They met at a coffee shop in Millbrook, and Henrik was amazed by how much the boy had grown. Tommy was tall and confident, with the same kind eyes but a maturity that spoke to everything he'd been through. "I'm proud of you," Tommy said as they sat down, "for telling the truth, for doing your time, for becoming someone better." "I'm proud of you too," Henrik replied, "for forgiving me, for growing up to be such a good man." They talked for hours, catching up on the years that had passed. Tommy was planning to study fire science in college, inspired by his own experience and his desire to help others. Elena had married David, the pediatrician, and they'd had a daughter together, Tommy's half-sister, who was now 3 years old. "Does she know about me?" Henrik asked. "About what happened? She will when she's old enough." Tommy said, "Mom believes in telling the truth, even when it's complicated." "And how is your mom?" Tommy smiled, She's happy, really happy, and she wants to see you when you're ready. A month later, Henrik had dinner with Elena, David, Tommy, and little Sophia at their home in Millbrook. It was awkward at first. How do you have a normal family dinner with the man who once burned down your house? But gradually, the conversation found its rhythm. Henrik had brought gifts, a hand-forged iron rose for Elena, a set of custom tools for Tommy's fire science studies, and a small toy hammer for Sophia. He'd made them all during his final months. In prison, using skills he'd learned in the metalworking program. I've started a non-profit, Henrik told them over dessert, for families affected by arson. Counseling, financial assistance, advocacy for better fire safety education. I want to use what I learned, both from my crimes and from my time in prison, to help others. That sounds perfect, Elena said, and Henrik could hear that she meant it. As the evening wound down, Tommy walked Henrik to his car. You know, the teenager said, I used to be angry that the fire happened, but I'm not anymore. Why not? Henrik asked. Because it brought you into our lives. And even though it started with something terrible, it led to something good. You became the father figure I needed, and we became the family you needed. That doesn't make the fire okay, but it makes what came after meaningful. Henrik hugged the boy, the man, really, that he'd saved and endangered and loved and guided. Thank you, he whispered, for saving me right back. As Henrik drove home to his small apartment, he thought about the strange paths that lead to redemption. He would never stop carrying the weight of what he'd done to Mrs. Chen and the trauma he'd inflicted on Tommy, but he'd learned that guilt could be transformed into purpose, that shame could become service, and that even the worst mistakes could lead to meaningful change. The fire had destroyed a house, but it had also forged bonds that nothing could break. Henrik had learned that sometimes the people we hurt the most become the ones who save us, and sometimes the act of saving someone else is really an act of saving ourselves. In the end, Henrik Johansson had become exactly what Tommy had always seen him as, a hero. Not because he was perfect, but because he'd found the courage to face his imperfections and transform them into something better. The boy had survived the fire, but it was the blacksmith who said it who had truly been saved by love, forgiveness, and the radical possibility of redemption. The story of the fire in Cedar Falls became a local legend, told and retold in different ways depending on who was speaking. But those who knew the truth understood that it wasn't really a story about fire at all. It was a story about the complex nature of human love, the power of confession, and the extraordinary possibility that our worst moments can become the foundation for our best selves. And in a small town in Minnesota, a man named Henrik Johansson continued his work of making amends, one family at a time, one day at a time, carrying the weight of his past while building something better for the future. Because sometimes, that's what redemption looks like, not the erasure of our sins, but the transformation of our guilt into grace.